My research is about blockchain technologies and the regulatory aspect, and now it's been about 7 years that I'm looking at this, and more and more as time goes, I become more and more interested in the question of governance of blockchain technology, and I'm looking in particular at the interplay between regulation and governance, and how governance actually becomes a fundamental question to address in order to then understand how we can regulate blockchain technologies. So I'm just going to start with a very short introduction of what are the specific characteristics of blockchain technology that make it, that distinguish it from traditional online services. First of all, it's a decentralized database, so it relies on peer-to-peer network. It is global and transnational, like the internet. It is also resilient in the sense that because every single node in the network holds a particular copy of the blockchain, then it's enough to have this single copy of the blockchain in order to then replicate again the network. It is non-coercive, and that's actually a very important property in the sense that, as opposed to traditional online platform, where the online operator can decide how to modify the code of the platform, and automatically those changes will be automatically imposed on the users of the platform. In the case of a blockchain, because it is a decentralized network, then every single node needs to agree to those changes by upgrading its own software. And then there is the tamper resistance of the system. So the blockchain technology is such that once information has been recorded in this decentralized database, it is virtually impossible to modify information that has been pre-recorded in the past. Most blockchains are also highly transparent because given that every single node in the network needs to verify and validate the transactions, then by definition, they need to have some kind of visibility about what those transactions are. It is non-repudiable because every transaction recorded on the blockchain is signed by the private key of the party recording it. And that means that one can no longer later on come and deny actually having executed this transaction because it has its own private key. And then the majority of public blockchain, at least, they are pseudonymous in the sense that one does not need to go and register an account towards an operator in order to be able to use the network. They just need to generate a public and private keeper in order to be able to use the network. And then finally, the most advanced type of blockchain introduced the possibility of adding software that will be executed in a decentralized manner by every single node of the network. And this software comes with this guarantee of execution, meaning that no one can unilaterally modify or even stop the execution of that software. And so this is like all the smart contract and the decentralized applications. So all those characteristics together are what actually have led people to consider that blockchains are trustless on the one hand, in the sense that because of the decentralization and the disintermediation, we no longer need to rely on an intermediary or trusted authority in order to operate on the network, and also that they are autonomous because they do not depend on anyone. And as long as there is a sufficient number of actors maintaining the network, then they will continue to operate, and most importantly, no one will be able to stop their operation. So all those things raise some very interesting questions with regard to the interplay between regulation, so the rule of law, and the technological framework. So the regulatory framework and the technological framework created by the blockchain are not necessarily compatible one with the other. And so how can they interact, and more importantly, how can regulation actually affect the execution and the operation of a blockchain? So a short introduction for the non-lawyers about the rule of law. So the rule of law is really this principle that no one is above the law. That means that everyone is equal and that the law applies equally to everyone, that the law should be transparent, clear, and precise and accessible, that everyone should have proper access to legal remedy, and most importantly, that the judiciary system be independent in order not to have like some possible political co-optation of the legal and judicial system. And then this goes in opposition to the concept of rule by law, and that's actually when there are some actors which are above the law, and those are like the sovereign, the dictators and so forth, which can actually instrumentalize the law as a tool of political power. And so if we look at the internet and we try to look at least at the old narratives of the internet, then early internet pioneers were advocating for the fact that the internet is actually neither ruled by law, because there is no single actor that can actually instrumentalize and coerce the use and the development of internet services, but also it's not based on the rule of law, because there is no such like the governments do not have the capacity or do not have the reach in order to actually control such a global and transnational network. And so the idea was that the cyberspace is this independent space that exists outside of the traditional legal framework. But then, of course, over time, we've seen that the internet kind of evolved, and as the commercial opportunities of the internet became more obvious, then we've seen like this concentration of power within a few large online platforms, Google, Apple, Facebook, that are really like collecting a large majority of the traffic of the internet. And so those platform operators actually become this kind of like functional sovereign or digital feudalism. And the idea is here we actually enter into, it's not ruled by law, but it's ruled by code, in which like the code of those platforms can be instrumentalized by those online operators in order to serve their own interest. And so this stands in contrast with blockchain technology, in which there is no sovereign. And so here, no one is above the code, meaning that once the code has been deployed on this blockchain infrastructure, then no one, even the person that deployed it, can actually intervene, can actually change and modify. So we have this system where there is some form of technical sovereignty, which is due by the polycentricity and the decentralized nature of the network. And so this is interesting, because when we look at like the way in which scholars have identified and analyzed the relationship between law and code, so we have Lawrence Lessig back in 2000 that actually came with this motto of like code is law, but code is law can mean different things depending on the platform that are used. And so the traditional system of like on operator, we are in a system ruled by the code, and that means that actually it is quite possible, and it's actually easy the more there is a concentration of power into a few large online operators, because then the regulators can identify who are those online intermediaries and regulate them, and therefore regulate the architecture, the code that they use on their platform, in order to then indirectly regulate the users. Whereas when we move into this model of like blockchain technology, where there is the rule of code, then those online operators disappear, and therefore it's harder for the traditional legal system, for the regulators to intervene or to influence onto those platforms, unless they can identify who are those new intermediaries, or who are the new choke points that can be used in order to shape and modify the architecture that will influence individual behaviors. And so when we talk about the internet, for a long time, there was this conception of like unregulability, meaning that it is difficult to regulate such a global and transnational network like the internet network. And then in the blockchain space, there is more of this, there's this new terminology of illegality, meaning that it's not just that it's hard to regulate, it's that those systems actually create their own technical framework that exists outside of the purview of the law, and so they cannot be touched or affected by the existing regulatory frameworks. And so we can already see a few applications of blockchain technology in which we can see this discrepancy, or this that actually enter into conflict with existing laws, whether it's about money laundering, whether it's about like the creation of decentralized marketplaces relying on cryptocurrency for the sale of illicit goods or services, whether it's about incorporating specific illicit content directly into the blockchain so that it can no longer be deleted, or all the question more recently, especially in Europe, with like the right to be forgotten. And then one domain which actually illustrates very nicely this discrepancy between the rule of law and the rule of code is in the domain of property. And so traditional property rights are defined by the law, and therefore they can also be taken away by the law. And so if I obtain a particular piece of property in a way that is not legitimate, then a judge can declare that I'm not the legitimate owner and therefore can seize this property from me. Whereas in the case of blockchain-based system and cryptographic assets, then the system is actually defined by the code, and so the ownership of those cryptographic assets is defined by the code and can only be taken away by the code. And so if I illegitimately acquire some Bitcoins, then regardless of what a judge might say, no one actually has the capacity to seize them from me unless the code actually provides for such a possibility. And similarly, in the case of contract law, then so we have traditional contracts which are defined by the law, and their enforcement relies on a third party, the judicial system, that will intervene by looking not necessarily at the wording of the contract, but actually by trying to understand what was the original intention of the parties entering into this contractual relationship. Whereas when we enter into those code-based and blockchain-based smart contract system, the contractual relationship is defined by the code and is automatically enforced by the underlying technology. And so it no longer looks at what is the intentionality of the parties, but will literally just looking at the wording of the code and will just execute that as planned. And so we have a very interesting example of this discrepancy, which happened in 2016 on the Ethereum network, which was related to this decentralized organization called the DAO, that was decentralized investment funds, where people could just send money to this blockchain-based application, and then this money could be reinvested into specific project, and then they will get a share on the profit made by the project. And the interesting aspect of this is that there was no director, no CEO, but there was no board of director of management. Everything was collectively managed by the investor themselves via smart contract transactions. And then one day, very soon, so after this fund has collected $160 million, at some point, someone identified a flaw in the code of this smart contract and exploited this flaw in order to drain about $50 million out of this decentralized investment fund. And this created a very interesting debate and discussion within the Ethereum community about what is the qualification of this action, whether it actually qualifies as a theft, because of course no one had intended the code to be used in this way, and all the people entering into this contractual relationship did not expect this to be possible. And so there was this understanding that the person abusing of this flow actually has stolen the money, and therefore it was legitimate to intervene in order to retrieve the money and give it to the original owners. But then there was another side of the argument which said, well, actually, if we look at the wording of the code, the smart contract was written in such a way that this was possible, and therefore the person exploiting this vulnerability did not do anything wrong except using the contract as it was written, and therefore it will actually be a theft to intervene and retrieve the funds from the person that just has taken them. And so this created a lot of discussion, but the most important question was that given that it is a trustless and autonomous system, then whatever the decision, like even if this was brought to court and a judge will say, yes, actually this is a theft, we should give the money back, there is actually no central authority that can enforce this decision, right? And so the big question is like, how into such a decentralized system, how can we actually intervene? And so in the case of these incidents in the Ethereum network, because there is no coercion possible, there was a general understanding, there was a large majority of the network that actually thought it was a theft and that the money should actually be taken back. But of course, this requires an intervention that is violating the rules of the blockchain, which is immutability and irreversibility. And so the conclusion is that this has led to a split of the network. And so a large majority of the network has actually intervened and has upgraded the software in order to modify the code so that the money will be taken away from the person that exploited the vulnerability and given back to the original owner. But then there was another side, another portion of the network that refused to upgrade their software. And therefore, the network has split into two separate networks, one in which the funds have not been retrieved and one in which it has been retrieved. And so the interesting thing here is that this actually qualifies as a state of exception, meaning that there has been a departure from the original protocol rules. And so just like in traditional government system, the rule of law can sometimes be displaced in case of a state of exception, in case of an emergency. Here again, in the same way, there has been a displacement of the traditional rule of code of the blockchain because there was a higher need, because there was an emergency that have to be dealt with. But then the question is that in a traditional governmental setting, there is a sovereign, and so it's easy to know who actually takes the power when we exit from the rule of law. Whereas in this case, unclear who is the sovereign, because it's a decentralized system and there is no central authority that can actually make decisions. And so this leads us to like the importance of this distinction when we look at blockchain governance between the governance by the infrastructure, where is basically the code, the rules that have been codified directly into the infrastructure. And those are usually highly formalized, very clear and visible. But at the same time, on the outside, there is all these governance of the infrastructure, which is all those actors that are actually interacting with each other and that can change those rules and that can deliberate and decide which are the new rules that should be incorporated. And while the on-chain governance, the governance by the infrastructure is very well analyzed and clear and understood, oftentimes there is very little understanding in many blockchain networks of how the governance of the infrastructure operates. And so basically, there are many actors that need to intervene and to agree one with each other, because there needs to be this distributed consensus. And so on the one hand, we have the developers that are proposing possible choices as to how the network should evolve, what is the new protocol. And then we have the miners and the validators, which need to adopt and accept those changes. But then there is also a lot of external actors. So we have like all the influencers, we have the people that have like strong reputation in the ecosystem because they are the founders, because they have technological expertise, or just because they have like a very loud voice on social media. And then we have also, of course, the mining pool, which have a very, very strong influence in the mining process. But also we have super nodes, which are usually the cryptocurrency exchanges or commercial operators, which do not really have a specific role into the network at the technical level, but on a commercial and on a gravitational force, they have a very strong influence, because if they choose to move into one network rather than the other, then all of their users and all the people that want to interact with their user will also make the same choice. And so they actually are almost the strongest actors in making decisions as to which change within a blockchain protocol will be adopted. And so to conclude, the conclusion is that actually no blockchain is an island, so we cannot really see those systems as existing outside of the purview of the law. There is always, even though it's sometimes indirect, there is always an avenue of maybe not direct regulation, but at least intervention. And basically we need to, in order to be able to understand how to regulate a blockchain-based system, we need to look at it from like a large ecosystemic view, and we need to understand it as a polycentric system of governance, where there is on the one hand the technical layer, which is governance by the infrastructure, but then there is also the social layer that needs to be accounted for. And the government, if they want to try and regulate the operation of a blockchain, they cannot just point to one of those actors. They actually need to manage to create a system in which all of those actors agree together to the same Schelling point, because that will be the only way in which the network can evolve towards a particular direction. So all this to say that basically when we're thinking about the regulation of blockchain technology, we need to actually have a proper understanding of how this ecosystem works. And the regulation cannot be like a traditional top-down regulation. It has to be a governance-based system of regulation, and understanding how this polycentricity operates and what are the different levels that governments can actually use or use pressure on in order to influence some actors more than others, and somehow manage to bring the Schelling point to where the governments want.